In 161 AD, Marcus Aurelius became the most powerful man in the world, and his first recorded act as emperor was not a declaration of war, not a display of dominance, not a celebration. He sat alone and wrote a single line to himself. You have power over your mind, not outside events. He wrote it not as wisdom for posterity. He wrote it as a command to himself, because the man who ruled the known world was waging a private war that no army could fight for him, the war against his own relentless, exhausting, suffocating self-awareness. Marcus Aurelius saw everything, every flaw in his character, every gap between who he was and who he intended to be, every consequence of every decision before he made it. And that ability, that same ability that made him one of the greatest leaders in human history, came within inches of making him completely unable to lead at all. There is a type of man that most people will never fully understand. He is not the loudest in the room. He is rarely the most confident. But he sees more than anyone around him. He reads the subtext of every conversation. He feels the weight of every decision before it arrives, and he carries a running internal commentary on everything he does wrong, could do better, and has not yet done at all. Most people would call this intelligence. And it is. But here is what the self-help industry will never tell you, and what the awareness trap actually does to a man. The same mind that sees everything clearly is the same mind that makes moving forward feel impossible. Because when you can see every flaw in your plan, every risk in your decision, every way something could fail, the brain does not experience that as information. It experiences it as threat. And when the brain experiences threat, it does not act. It freezes. It analyzes. It waits for certainty that will never arrive. The most self-aware men in any room are frequently the most paralyzed, not in spite of what they see, because of it. There is a specific pattern I call the awareness trap. Once you see it, you will recognize it operating in your own life with a precision that is uncomfortable. The awareness trap works like this. A man develops genuine self-awareness, the ability to see himself clearly, to understand his patterns, to recognize his flaws with unusual accuracy. This is real and valuable, but instead of that awareness becoming fuel for action, it becomes the reason action is delayed. Because the aware man always sees one more thing to fix, one more variable to account for, one more way he is not yet ready. And the gap between seeing and doing becomes the place where years disappear. The awareness trap does not look like laziness. It does not look like fear. It looks exactly like preparation. That is what makes it the most dangerous trap a sharp mind can fall into. The Stoics were the first philosophers in history to specifically address this problem, not as a philosophical abstraction, but as a survival issue. Epictetus, who was born a slave and became the most influential philosopher of his age, wrote in the Discourses, and I quote, "First say to yourself what you would be, then do what you have to do." That sentence, written in approximately 108 AD, is the direct antidote to the awareness trap. Epictetus had watched men with tremendous intellectual capability be destroyed not by their enemies, not by circumstance, but by the infinite loop of self-examination without resolution. He understood that awareness is not the destination. It is the beginning of a process that must end in action, or it becomes poison. Marcus Aurelius returned to this theme obsessively throughout the Meditations, written between 161 and 180 AD. He wrote, "Confine yourself to the present." Not because the past and future are unimportant, because the man who lives entirely in the analysis of what was and what might be never fully inhabits the moment where action is actually possible. But knowing these principles and being able to live by them are two completely different things. And the reason most self-aware men cannot bridge that gap has nothing to do with how much philosophy they have read. It has everything to do with what is physically happening inside the brain when awareness becomes overwhelming. James was 31 years old, lived in Edinburgh, Scotland, and by every external measure had no reason to be stuck. He had a postgraduate degree in philosophy. He had read more books on psychology, productivity, and self-improvement than most people read in a lifetime. He understood his own patterns with a clarity that regularly stunned therapists and friends alike. He could explain with precise psychological vocabulary exactly why he procrastinated. He could map the exact childhood dynamics that had shaped his relationship with risk. He could articulate the cognitive distortions that made starting new projects feel disproportionately dangerous. He understood all of it. And he had not started the business he had been planning for 4 years. He had not ended the relationship he knew, with complete certainty, was slowly making both him and her worse. He had not applied for the position he was objectively qualified for and genuinely wanted. His notebooks were full. His life was not moving. He had a friend, older, less educated, significantly less self-aware, who had started 3 businesses in the same 4 years, 2 of which had failed, and 1 of which was quietly generating income. The friend did not understand why things worked. He simply tried things until something did. James watched this and felt something he could not immediately name. It was not jealousy exactly. It was the specific ache of a man who sees the distance between himself and where he wants to be with perfect clarity and cannot close it. James found his mentor not in a book, but in the chair across from him at a philosophy reading group in the city. His name was Daniel, 58 years old, former academic, quiet in the way that signaled thought rather than absence. After the 3rd session, Daniel said something that stopped James completely. "You are the most articulate person in this room about the nature of your own limitations, which tells me you have spent a very long time making peace with them." James did not respond immediately. He had learned that silence in response to precision was more honest than a quick defense. "I am not making peace with them," James said finally. "I am trying to understand them." "Understanding them," Daniel said, "is not the same as moving through them. In fact, and this is the thing most intelligent men resist hearing, understanding them too well can become the reason you never move through them at all." Right now you are probably thinking, "This is just about overthinking." I already know I overthink. The solution is obviously to just act. And before you say it, yes, I know. You have heard the just start advice. You have tried it. And the part that nobody explains is why the self-aware man specifically cannot simply decide to just start, even when he knows intellectually that starting is the answer. The reason is not psychological weakness, it is neurological architecture. And that is what Daniel was beginning to explain. But the explanation Daniel gave James that evening was not the one either of them expected. Because the problem was not in James's thinking, it was in what his thinking had been doing to his nervous system for years without him realizing it. Daniel had spent 20 years studying Stoic philosophy, not as an academic exercise, but as a practical system for exactly this problem. He had watched dozens of brilliant men, students, colleagues, friends, be consumed by their own capacity for self-examination. "The Stoics had a clearer way to describe the state you are in," Daniel said. "They called it akrasia, not rest, not peace. Akrasia, the state in which a man has all the elements required for movement but keeps finding a reason, usually an intelligent-sounding one, why movement is not yet appropriate." "And the cure?" James asked. "They called it kathekon, appropriate action." The Stoics believed that every moment contains a specific appropriate action that does not require certainty, does not require readiness, does not require the elimination of all possible risk. It requires only that it is the most reasonable next move available given what you currently know. Daniel paused. "Your problem, James, is not that you do not know what to do. It is that you have set the threshold for certainty so high that no available action ever crosses it. You are waiting to be sure. And the Stoics knew certainty is not a precondition for action. It is the reward that sometimes comes after." If you are honest with yourself, the question in your mind right now is, what is the threshold I have actually set? And how long have I been holding everything to a standard that nothing real can meet? That question is the beginning of the second concept this video is going to name. Most people stop at the philosophical explanation. They hear "set a lower threshold for action" and they treat it as motivational advice. But what is actually happening in the brain of the hyper-aware man is a specific and documented neurological process, and understanding it changes everything about how to break out of it. Dr. Ethan Kross, director of the Emotion and Self-Control Laboratory at the University of Michigan, spent over a decade studying what he calls chatter, the internal voice that activates when a man turns his attention inward. His research, published in his book Chatter in 2021, found something that cuts directly against everything the self-improvement industry teaches about self-reflection. Kross found that self-focused rumination, the kind of deep, recursive self-examination that highly self-aware men engage in constantly, activates the brain's threat detection system with the same intensity as a physical danger. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for rational decision-making, becomes suppressed. The amygdala, which governs the fight-flight-freeze response, becomes dominant. In plain terms, the more intensely a self-aware man examines his own situation, the more his brain physically treats that situation as a threat, and the harder it becomes to act, not because he lacks the will, but because his nervous system is operating in a state designed for survival, not for construction. Kross also found, and this is the contrast that lands hardest, that men who used what he called psychological distance, referring to themselves in the third person during moments of high self-reflection, showed dramatically reduced threat activation and significantly improved decision-making and follow-through. Marcus Aurelius had no access to neuroscience, but he wrote the meditations in the third person, addressing himself as you, not I. You have power over your mind, not I have power. You. He was creating psychological distance from himself 2,000 years before the research existed to explain why it worked. And yet what Kross discovered in a laboratory in Michigan, Marcus Aurelius was practicing in a Roman military tent in the 2nd century. But the science does not just validate the ancient practice, it also reveals something the Stoics could not articulate, exactly where the threshold must be set and why the self-aware man has been setting it in the wrong place his entire life. Most men hear the science and stop there. They think the insight is about self-compassion or reducing negative self-talk. But what Kross's research actually points to goes one level deeper, to the moment when James finally understood not just what was happening, but what to do about it that would actually hold. 3 weeks after the conversation with Daniel, James had tried the standard interventions. He had set deadlines. He had used accountability partners. He had meditated. He had tried the 5-second rule, the 2-minute rule, every productivity framework designed to manufacture momentum. None of them had lasted more than 10 days. He went back to Daniel not with a question, but with a confession. Nothing sticks. I understand the problem completely. I can feel myself starting, and then I feel myself stopping, and I can watch it happening in real time and still not prevent it. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You are trying to solve a threshold problem with a motivation solution. They are not the same thing." What is a threshold problem? The threshold is the internal bar a man sets for what counts as enough certainty, enough readiness, enough preparation before action is permitted. Most men set this bar at a reasonable height. Intelligent, self-aware men set it higher because they can see more of what could go wrong, so they require more certainty before they move. The bar itself is the problem, not your motivation, not your discipline, the bar. Then, how do I lower it? Daniel did not answer immediately. He picked up a notebook from the table beside him and wrote 2 words. He passed it to James. The 2 words were, "Decide first." The Stoics understood, Daniel said, that action does not follow certainty. Action follows decision. And a decision, unlike certainty, does not require complete information. It requires only that you commit to a direction before you feel ready, and hold that commitment long enough for the first result to arrive. The first result is what lowers the bar permanently, not insight, evidence. James looked at the 2 words for a long time. That night he sent 1 email, not the business plan, not the full proposal. 1 email to 1 potential client asking if they had a problem he might be able to solve. It was the smallest possible action. The bar had been set so low that failure was almost structurally impossible. The client replied in 4 hours, "You are not James. But the awareness trap is operating in your life right now. The specific version of it that belongs to you looks different from James's, but the structure is identical. There is something you understand with complete clarity that you have not acted on. There is a decision you have been preparing for long enough that the preparation has become the substitute for the decision itself. There is a bar in your mind, the threshold you have set for what counts as ready, and that bar is sitting at a height that no real-world action can clear. This is not a failure of character. It is the predictable consequence of a mind that sees clearly operating inside a system designed for a different kind of man. The awareness is real. The capability is real. What is missing is not insight. You have more than enough insight. What is missing is the willingness to act before the insight feels complete. And the brutal truth is this: the insight never feels complete. That feeling of incompleteness is permanent. The man who waits for it to resolve will wait until he runs out of time. The antidote to the awareness trap is not less self-awareness. Attempting to think less is not the answer, and it is not possible for the kind of mind this video is about. The antidote is what I call the action threshold, the deliberate, conscious lowering of the internal bar that determines what counts as enough readiness to begin. The action threshold is not a mindset shift. It is a structural decision made once before the next moment of paralysis arrives about what the minimum viable action looks like in any given situation. Not the best action, not the fully prepared action. The smallest action that moves in the direction of the result, the one so small that the self-aware mind cannot construct a credible argument against it. Because the self-aware mind is extraordinarily good at arguing against large actions, it is almost defenseless against small ones. Set the action threshold low enough that starting is structurally easier than not starting. Then raise it, but only after the first result arrives. Evidence is the only thing that permanently lowers the internal bar. Not philosophy, not motivation, not another framework. Evidence that you moved and the world did not end. Marcus Aurelius governed the Roman Empire for 19 years. He fought wars on two fronts simultaneously. He managed plague, famine, political betrayal, and the constant knowledge that the most powerful position in the known world was balanced on decisions he could never be fully certain about. He never resolved his self-awareness. He never became the man who stopped seeing everything. He became the man who acted anyway, while continuing to see everything, because he had lowered the action threshold to the only place it can actually function. The present moment, the next move, the smallest step that is honest. He wrote, in the final years of his reign, when the empire was at its most fragile, "Do what nature requires. Get moving immediately if possible. Don't look around to see if people will know about it. Not when you are ready. Not when the plan is complete. Not when the risk has been eliminated. Now, the next move, the one that is available. You have been aware long enough. The threshold has been high enough. The preparation has been thorough enough. The only thing left is the action that is available to you tonight, not the one that will be available when you are ready, because that moment does not exist. The one that is available right now in the life you actually have, with the clarity you already possess. Lower the bar. Take the step. Let the evidence arrive. That is what Marcus Aurelius did every morning for 19 years, and it is the only thing that separates the man who sees everything from the man who builds everything.